You are about to watch an interview I recorded with an American foreign volunteer by the name of James, also known as Spaghetti Cossack, who volunteered to fight in the Ukrainian military with the International Legion and other military units all across Ukraine. This included dangerous recon missions on the front line, like in this footage taken from his current unit. This will be the first of two videos, with this one covering his time fighting in Ukraine, and the next video covering his political beliefs surrounding the war. The purpose of this interview is to give you an unfiltered look into his unique perspective as a foreign volunteer. This video does not serve as an endorsement or condemnation, but as a window into his service and the mind behind the rifle. His beliefs, motivations, experiences, and first-hand testimony of the war serves as one puzzle piece for the generations that come after us in understanding what drove the men and women who fought in, or just tried to survive, the largest war in Europe since World War II. This is Ukraine Uncensored. So, are you ready?
Yeah, that's good.
Fantastic. So, thank you for taking the time to be interviewed today. I really appreciate it. Definitely because I don't just consider you somebody doing amazing work here in defending Ukraine, but also I consider you a friend, and so I appreciate you taking time out of your day to do this with me. The first thing I wanted to ask you about is, obviously you are a Yankee, an American, of red, white, and blue, red-blooded. So why are you in Ukraine? Why did you feel the compulsion to come here and fight in Ukraine?
Well, I have a very long history in Ukraine and also in the region. Ironically, I actually spent more time living in Russia. And the funny thing is, sometimes when people know that and they ask me, why did you end up fighting for Ukraine? I said, well, because I lived in Russia. That's the best motivation to fight for Ukraine, is just, seeing what it's like in Russia and seeing that system, and you don't want it to spread further. But I've been coming to Ukraine off and on from going back to about 2007. In terms of post Maidan and everything, I started coming in 2015. That is when I had already gotten into journalism, and I was going to Donbass first on my own, and then I went with Robert Evans, who you would know from Crack.com, and of course he has his Behind the Bastards podcast.
Fantastic journalist.
Yeah, machete enthusiast as well. And that, from there, my journalism career, so to speak, sort of was like a springboard. By 2016, I was becoming more radicalized and fed up with the whole situation. And I decided, I had seen that the Ukrainian military was taking, foreigners legally under contract in the military. And
what year was this again?
Well, that was the decision. The decision I had to go and do it was in 2016. That's when they passed the legislation. I had to wait till 2017 to actually be able to go. And then I just kind of ran into a bureaucratic.
So you joined before 2022.
I attempted to join.
You attempted to join.
Yeah. Some people managed to get contracts. You probably heard one of them was a POW after the whole Mariupol battle here.
You're talking about Aiden, right?
Aiden,
yeah.
right. Like, he had managed to get a contract, and I know there were a few other foreigners who managed to do it. Oddly enough, even though I was able to go through the whole process, myself without interpreters, I was not able to get the contract. It wasn't like they said no. It was more like, we'll call you, and I'm running out of money, you know what I mean? And so that was just really a matter of bureaucracy. I had talked to some Ukrainians who said they saw the same thing happen with actual Ukrainian citizens, where they just couldn't get a contract, and there was a lot of apathy about the war at that time, and the apathy kind of just got worse until all of this started. But anyway, having failed to join the first time, I sort of resolved I had to move back to the States after over 10 years abroad, and I resolved to kind of work as a volunteer. I had been on the front lines before, so I wanted to get as close to the front as possible and just do whatever I could. I figured once a year I could go for 2 weeks and just do whatever is useful, in addition to other stuff that I do from the States. And unfortunately, that was kind of hard to get that off the ground, especially because of COVID, obviously. But as soon as it was feasible for me to actually do that in 2021, late 2021, I was able to actually go to the front, and I delivered some medical supplies to the medics. I raised money for that for my YouTube channel, on Twitter. Most of it was out of my pocket, though. I didn't really have as big a following back then. And of course, people didn't pay as much attention to Ukraine at the time. But I was doing things like that, the volunteering. I was donating money and stuff like that. And then when this buildup was happening, I came here in February with the idea, because since I work remotely, the idea was that I could work and help train territorial defense or something like that. Yeah.
So you do have military experience, right?
Yeah. Well, I have a lot more than I did when I started. Now,
yeah, you wanted to train. You wanted to help with training, so you had experience in the United States military.
Yeah, the U.S. Army. I got out in 2002. It was. I don't really have an illustrious military career to brag about, but after the military, as much as my time in the Army kind of sucked, I did actually like the job. Right, I spent a lot of time studying your basic infantry tactics and similar topics like that. And so, in terms of like basic rifle marksmanship and individual movement skills and stuff like that, training territorial defense people, a lot of these people had never touched a firearm before, right? So it's important is you got to know your limitations and not try to make yourself seem like more of an expert than you actually are.
What would you say the age range is for territorial defense?
It varies quite a bit. A lot of it seems to be older people. That was what was quite interesting early in the war in Sumy. The Russians were just getting their asses handed to them there, and a lot of this was being done strictly by territorial defense units. And when you look at some of these people, they're quite old.
To clarify, what's the difference between territorial defense and like a regular Ukrainian soldier?
Yeah, so the territorial defense, TDF, this was something they were supposed to create years ago. I know right before this invasion happened, there was a bit of a scandal about legislation to make the TDF or something like that, and it's really confusing and Byzantine, so I can't say with authority exactly, because the truth is sometimes some TDF units are obviously very lightly armed and maybe not well trained or whatever, but then other TDF units have fought alongside regular military units and have a lot of experience and were very critical, especially early on in the invasion.
So the general idea, though, is that it's locals being able to defend their villages, defend their towns.
That's what the idea was supposed to be, although I think it mutated a lot just because, for example, the first unit that I really spent significant time with serving in Ukraine was 518th Separate Special Purpose Battalion. It was initially part of a brigade, the 1st Separate Special Purpose Brigade. So these names can get very long sometimes. But that unit was nominally under TDF. Now, I don't know if in the order of battle they consider it TDF. I can tell you that it wasn't particularly well equipped when I was in it. But I don't know if that was just a bureaucratic thing because they needed to put it under some structure, or if they just say, this is a regular Army unit, but it has to be under TDF. So what the TDF actually is can vary a lot depending on what unit we're talking about, because I've heard some bad things about some TDF units, but I've also heard about TDF units that are just like utter badasses with a lot of combat experience.
Do you think a lot of it depends on the trainer or the type of people that are from that community who join?
I think it's a little bit of both. One thing is like in my first unit, we had a core of people who had experience from the war starting in 2014. And unfortunately, they did not always have all the authority in the unit, or they didn't always have the authority to do things as they wanted. However, their presence there, I think, was very important. And I think that's what you see in a lot of units, and not just TDF units, just wherever you have veterans who are already serving in the Donbass war, you'll have that that higher quality because of the experience, right? And also, there were Ukrainians, for example, who had served in the army and had had the chance to train in Germany with like Western trainers and stuff like that. So they bring that knowledge back, because you have to remember that in 2014, when the war really started, Ukraine really had no functional army. It had been allowed to decay and degenerate mostly under Yanukovych. And that was kind of by design, so that Ukraine, because the idea was that Russia wanted to transform Ukraine into a sort of second Belarus, a subservient dictatorship. And it's Maidan that stopped that dictatorship from establishing itself. But the offshoot of that is that there still was no coherent military. So when the war started, the Ukraine, I hear variations of Ukraine had between 3,000 and 6,000 effective troops. And that's not saying much, right? So this country had to basically learn in the forge of war for about 8 years. What is more is that...
Do you think they have learned?
Absolutely. I mean, you can see that. But what's interesting is that for most of that 8 years, they were not getting any Western, arms in terms of like support. Most of the support was non-lethal. Obama famously wanted to limit it to non-lethal. Merkel and the Germans, they refused to sell arms to Ukraine pretty much until after this invasion. And almost nobody wanted to sell arms to Ukraine. The javelins, the famous javelins that they've been asking for, the first shipment of those showed up in middle of 2018. And that was mostly because they believe that the then Defense Secretary Mattis basically twisted Trump's arm on that, and because Trump did not want to give any arms to Ukraine. He tried to get the lethal aid for Ukraine removed from the Republican platform in 2016. I'll just say this, because I don't know a lot about your audience, but when it comes to U.S. presidents being bad on Russia policy, don't think I'm picking on your guy, whether it's Obama or Trump or Bush or whatever, because I have like a list, like Santa Claus, a naughty list of U.S. presidents going all the way back to George Herbert Walker Bush, about like all their kowtowing to Russia and everything like that. So in this case, like nobody is righteous. So basically, Ukraine had to cope with this lack of a lot of modern weaponry right up until the invasion. I remember they really started delivering stuff rapidly in December, if I remember correctly, December of 2021. And back then, when you talked about tanks or you talked about Patriots, you can't send Patriots. Patriots take too long to learn, and the tanks can't send tanks. It's just can't. So in the beginning, like a lot of the weaponry was Bayraktars, javelins, NLAWs, things like that. And which, by the way, javelins and NLAWs and stuff like that were very good in the hands of territorial defense, because they use small unit partisan tactics and things like that.
Doesn't take not awfully difficult to learn.
Yeah, they're pretty easy. I mean, like I've never really had formal javelin training. I learned from guys who did, and I read the manual. You know what I mean? And Stinger training, I had like a day on the Stinger. And the rest is all manual and videos. And you can figure these things out yourself. Deploying them is another story, but people, ordinary people joining up in a sort of militia like the TDF could theoretically be trained to use these weapons fairly quickly.
So I want to bring it back to, because you were talking about 2021, you're delivering aid, you're delivering medical aid, but obviously in 2022, something big happened.
Yeah.
What was your reaction to it? Because a lot of people were caught by extreme surprise, didn't think it was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And what did you do once you saw that the Russians had are now invading the whole country, trying to conquer all of Ukraine?
You know, I think that because I listen to some very respected military analysts, and maybe they shouldn't be so respected anymore, but there are some people who actually did know their shit, basically, and they were saying that this is going to be an absolute disaster. And honestly, I was, almost in a panic. I stayed up that first night, like until 7 a.m. I had to call in sick the next day.
Do you remember how you found out?
I knew it was happening, and I tried to distract myself by, doing a stream on my YouTube channel with the video game, and people kept saying, it's happening. And I said, look, there's nothing I can do right now about that. I was kind of resigned to the scenario, not the 3 days to Kyiv scenario, but everything that was being predicted up to that point was very negative. And you got to understand that I had a lot of friends here, and it was a place. I spent a lot of time here. There's a lot of
you have a lot of ties to the country.
Over the years, I certainly built a lot of ties, and imagine if you just thought that for the rest of your life you're never going to be able to visit that again, and your friends may be dead, because I really expected this invasion to grab a huge chunk of the country, and then the West wouldn't do anything the same way they acted in 2014, and it would just come down to, we can't escalate, let's negotiate something, and you'd have a huge swath of Ukraine occupied, and maybe a puppet regime in Kyiv or something like that, So it's like this place that you want to go to at least once a year, or a place that, you have all these friends in, you won't be able to go there anymore. And it's almost like the world is ending, your world is ending.
So I wanted to move on to your work in the military, and I wanted to specifically ask you because the invasion happens, you're a little bit distant from it. It's kind of hard to process because it's all your friends. You eventually make the decision to come over, and am I right in saying that you joined with the Foreign Legion?
It's the International Legion. That seemed to me the easiest way to get in. It was not. It would have been my first choice because I prefer to work with Ukrainians generally. But it seemed the easiest way.
Do you speak quite fluent Ukrainian?
Yeah, and I just when foreign fighters started to come over, or foreign wannabe fighters started to come over, there was a lot of people who I feel didn't really understand the conflict and may have not come over for the best reasons, and in some cases were liabilities, and many of these people were weeded out. I mean, you will hear stories about some bad apples and stuff, but what you don't hear about is like how many of these idiots were rejected like almost immediately.
How quickly did that happen? Because there were stories of people who thought it would be like an easy time, or played video games and wanted to come over. How quickly was it for them to realize, like, oh no, this is a serious war where we can get bombed and die?
Yeah, well, probably one of the key events was when Yavoriv was hit with cruise missiles. This is no secret. Everybody knows it was. Everybody knows where it was. The Russians already knew at the time. But before that, you had a lot of these wannabe volunteers TikToking their way through Poland into Ukraine, and just streaming everything. And I would say I still have a strong belief that them doing that probably brought the strike on, and the reason is because just as that became a big news story, you had international media reporting on it, and then the Russian foreign ministry started threatening, these mercenary activities, you'll become targets, blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly the base where a lot of these guys were going was hit. Do you
think that was meant to discourage people from coming?
Almost definitely, yeah. And there were, several dozen people killed in that, and after that you heard stories of guys saying like, I didn't expect it, this is not what I signed up for, fuck this. And some of them, to be fair, some of them just kind of admitted that they were wrong, and then they went to Poland and started doing humanitarian work. But yeah, there were a lot of guys who had multiple deployments in Afghanistan or Iraq, and they seemed to have thought that they would come here and it would be like kicking in doors in Fallujah, or patrolling in somewhere in Afghanistan.
So a lot of the people who were shocked were not just like like Reddit gamers or something, but veterans.
No, I've actually heard multiple stories of actual veterans with multiple deployments. When they start getting shelled by conventional artillery or those cruise missiles and stuff like that, some of these people just shit their pants or just said fuck it and they leave, and that's that's good for them. I think that gets into a very complicated topic of veterans and the veteran identity and vet bro culture and stuff like that. With me, I feel like I had a bit of an advantage, not just because of my actual prior experience in the country and experience on the front line, but it was the paradox of my so-called military career in the U.S. Army was that we were very much living. This is a pre-9/11 Army, right? And so we're very much living in a world of the first Gulf War and some peacekeeping operations. And in those days, our unit would rotate to NTC in California, and they would fight conventional battles, like our tanks versus their tanks, and there would be artillery strikes and Grad salvos or whatever they would simulate there, right? They would have
all of it's war games,
right? Like it's war games, but the idea is that you are training with the idea that. It was very much like Gulf War, Cold War, I want to say how do you call it, leftovers, sort of as a legacy of the Cold War and Desert Storm and everything. But there is a certain advantage in that, in the sense that we were trained with the idea that you may get attacked by tanks. You could get attacked by conventional artillery. You might even get attacked from the air. We didn't just have the assumption that, oh yeah, we'll have air superiority, even though we kind of knew we would. We didn't work from that assumption. At least it felt that way to me as a private first class. But because of that mentality, after I got out of the Army, I had a big interest in insurgency and terrorism, because by then, this is after 9/11, by the time I got out. And so I was very interested in the concept of insurgents fighting better equipped militaries, right? And that, in a way, is what we've been doing here. You see a lot of the tactics, especially with your anti-tank missiles. A lot of the tactics are, insurgent tactics, right? They had a woman, I believe she was a former RADA deputy, who was driving around in her own private car with a ATGM, anti-tank guided missile system, in the trunk of her car, and she was driving around and hunting tanks during the early invasion period. In other cases, you had guys using stingers. The way we use drones is very similar to the techniques that were being used by ISIS. In fact, one slogan we had in my team is that we are the insurgent, we are the Taliban. And we are, we make IEDs, and we, try to figure out how to use drones or ambush tanks and stuff like that. And so,
is that jolting to go from somebody who's working in the most powerful military in the world to viewing yourself as an insurgent?
I think that maybe for the guys who are really the guys, because when I was in the Army, I wasn't deployed anywhere. I was stateside the entire time, right? And I think some of these guys, if their whole Army career was several deployments to Afghanistan or Iraq and counterinsurgency, and they go from that and they have to go to this, and they don't know the country and they don't know what they're dealing with, then I'm sure it is probably very jarring. I was told by a teammate that they had a guy who was a former Marine on their team, and at some point in the field, when they were observing enemy positions, he says, "We need close air support." Close air support, yeah, let me go on the radio and get your close air support. And while we're at it, maybe we should have the orbital ion cannon hit them first, or maybe drop Space Marines in orbital drop pods. While we're wishing for things here, right? When you go out there, you will walk with weapons that typically would be driven around, or the first time I went into combat here, we had nothing that you could call a mission briefing. It was basically get on this bus and go to this point, and then you're going to walk this way, and you go in this forest and hopefully link up with us. and I'm just going along with the patrol. So now, to be fair, like the unit that I've served in, that I've been serving in since then, like we do a lot better at that. But that was something. That's something you have to expect here, is that you're not going to get the 5-paragraph op order that you would get in a NATO army. You're not going to, you're not going to have air support. You might not have artillery support. You might not even have radios. So you just have to deal with that. So when I think a lot of people, even with military experience, were weeded out. And by the way, I'm definitely not the first person saying this. There was a guy who was in the International Legion being interviewed about this, and he said basically the same thing. They meet guys who did have military experience, and for whatever reason, they didn't think that the Russian military has main battle tanks and conventional artillery and all this stuff.
They're used to fighting guys in caves.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Is like I've been shelled with heavy artillery, with cluster munitions. I've been shot at by some vehicle, shot at by tanks, and even had to hit the dirt for an air attack. Luckily, it didn't get that close, but you couldn't see where it was going until it was too late. So you get in the dirt anyway. And that's something, worrying about air attack is not something NATO militaries, especially the U.S., has had to worry about in a long time. And then there's also drones too. I know that in more modern times, insurgents have been using drones. I think the Taliban have been using drones. But out here, when you don't have any kind of anti-drone gear and you're trying to advance and you hear that buzzing sound, and the worst thing is when you hear the buzzing sound, you're not sure where it's coming from, and you hear that little sound a drone makes when it stops. It's like zzz.
Sounds like a phone vibrating, maybe a swarm of bees.
Yeah, exactly. And when you hear that and you're wondering, is it over me? And if it is over me, does it have a munition on it? Because one thing you don't want to do is look up. Like the human face is so recognizable to another human, and if you look up, they're definitely gonna see you there. So you just have to get under some foliage or something and just hope that they don't see you. But yeah, that's a lot of people. I know there's a lot of derision about they called forwarders a Reddit brigade and everything. And honestly, I do not understand this Reddit thing very much. I barely even ever used that site, so I don't understand the significance of that. But what's
I think it's, the idea is just cringe is the idea that cringe terminally online. That's the idea.
Yeah. Now that I get, but I wouldn't call people who actually got off their ass and tried to come here and in some cases served. I wouldn't call them cringe. And I'll say one thing. I was briefly in the International Legion back in the summer, just between units, and the guys I met there. These were guys who were together at Yavoriv, and they were there when the cruise missiles hit, and they stayed. And they were in the Legion's first deployment, which was pretty chaotic and quite fucked up, to be honest. And they stayed through that. And for like, you cannot accuse them of being not being dedicated or calling them war tourists or. They're certainly not cowards. I mean, they're certainly brave guys, especially since they assume that any mission they get is going to be a suicide mission. They still go. So, that's...
what do you mean by that?
I think it's because I know they told me stories about the first deployment of that battalion, and I think it was the same issue that I was dealing with in my unit, like not a lot of information, not a lot of coordination, and just basically things going to hell in a handbasket. Unfortunately, like sometimes that happens, but I mean, like I said, I mean, they kept going out and doing it.
Did it improve with time?
I think that the Legion, I can't speak for them because I don't really have much of a connection to them. But I think that their situation has definitely improved. I think it's improved more than when I was there. Certainly more than when I showed up, because when I showed up, like I said, I thought the Legion was probably my best way in. I got to their training camp, and I was just like, this looks like a clusterfuck. And that was the opinion of some people who had been in the military a lot longer than me, people who I would defer to. And so we were like, yeah, we're leaving, and we ended up going in another unit. But yeah, definitely the Legion's definitely in some of the biggest hotspots now, and
They
a
were
lot of them
involved
have
in the
given their.
defense of Severodonetsk, if I remember correctly.
I believe that was a Gore team, but yeah, there was definitely foreigners there. In fact, I know one of them who was there, and he's a guy who posted a pretty popular video online of some of the urban fighting there. So yeah, definitely like Legionnaires have been involved in some pretty intense combat. They've certainly suffered casualties as well, and. I've witnessed one of these casualties in one case because I'm not part of Legion, but our team will often work with guys from the 3rd Battalion of it. Yeah.
I want to ask you before we move on to moving past the International Legion, past that original chaos.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people have read the Kiev Independent article about how the Foreign Legion was when it talks about like Polish gangsters and other types of tomfoolery that went on. What is your impression of all those stories that came out about the Foreign Legion and people lying about the credentials and stuff like that?
Not a lot of it surprised me. When I was coming in to actually join, they sat me down with this British guy who was supposedly an ex-British military officer. And this is really funny that he was grilling me about not having my DD-214 with me because I was told I didn't need it, and I have only one copy of my DD-214. It's like the Declaration of Independence. I keep it in plastic. I've had to take it out for a couple occasions, and every time I do, I'm super careful with it. But the thing is, like, when anyone asks about my military background, like, I just tell them, and like only an idiot would lie about this because it's not going to impress anybody. You know what I mean? And but this guy was grilling me about that, and what was really funny is a while later he was exposed as a fake who had never been in the military at all.
Really?
And yeah, he ended up. They tried to get rid of him from.
Dost thou protest too much?
Exactly. It was pretty funny. Actually, we were the ones who got him deported from the country a second time. But the guy was a
deported and he came back.
He did. He tried to get back in and tried to claim he was going to start a new unit. Then very stupidly tried to join the unit we were in, and we started to realize the more we talked to him, because, he's the only British guy there, right? And so none of us are experts in the British military. And the guy kind of, talks the part, but these red flags just kept popping up, and eventually they add up enough, and that's when we found some other people had, some actual, like, British people had managed to bust this guy. And so, we got him driven to the border, and supposedly he was homeless in Poland.
Homeless in Poland.
Yeah.
I remember you once told me about him. Was he begging for a bit in Poland? Like telling people that he was like a Ukraine hero?
I have a feeling that's what he did when he kicked out Poland the first time, and I think he did the same thing when he was kicked out a second time. I have a feeling that he was telling all these people stories, probably telling women stories about how he was fighting in Ukraine and everything like that. And I'm sure there's a lot of those people. I hear stories all the time about guys in Lviv. It's in Western Ukraine, for those who don't know. Guys in Lviv who walk around in tactical gear, and they're on Instagram, and people are saying, "Oh, you're in a war zone, stay safe," and they talk about going on missions and operations, and meanwhile they're just in Renuk Square drinking, at bars there. And to be fair, to respect to the there are civilian volunteers in Lviv, and they are under threat of cruise missile strikes and drone strikes, but they're actually contributing to the war effort. You know what I mean? They're not just, drinking and playing soldier online. So as for the other story, the stories about, the nightmare commanders and everything, I've been very lucky. We had, problems. The unit that I served in initially was a Ukrainian unit, and we had minor issues with the way the command did some things, but nothing like that. And then the unit that I eventually ended up in, I will say our officer is one of the finest. And there was a situation once where me and my buddy were mistakenly reported dead and wounded. And basically, we were confused for two other people who, two Legionnaires who were dead and wounded. And when that news got back to him, we were out of contact, so we couldn't contact him directly. When that news got back to our officer, he was about to drive. He was on his way driving, the 150 kilometers or so just to get out there to find out what happened to us. So My officer is great. Our officer is wonderful. As for the other stories, like I can believe them, but you also have to remember that all of this was done very hastily. I mean, and maybe you could fault Zelensky for just putting out this blanket call for foreign fighters without too much, planning. But it was, it was improvised and it's all very chaotic. But it's been working.
Do you think it has made a genuine contribution to the war effort?
I wouldn't say decisive, but I think it is certainly a significant contribution. I think most of the decisive fighting has been done by Ukrainians. And one thing I like to point out, because there's one thing I hate about the media is that they are always chasing foreign fighters, and there's this like romance about the foreign fighter. And sometimes I think it's just like media people who don't want to pay fixers or interpreters. But like I've been asked for interviews, like literally I was asked for an interview as I was crossing the border. Right? I hadn't even done anything, and I'm just walking there, and I basically turned down most interviews. I only do podcasts of friends of mine, people I've known for years, or like in your case, because friend, someone I've known for a while online. And so I always try to emphasize in any interview that the Ukrainians are fighting the bulk of this war. They are suffering the most and they are sacrificing the most. And it's, I know there are many foreigners out there with their heart in the right place. They're really trying and they've done wonderful things here. But you always have to remember that many of us, like we can just go home, you know what I mean? And if Ukraine had total victory tomorrow, these people will still have to go back to a country that's half destroyed, and they'll have to help millions of people come back. Many of them don't really have homes to come back to, so it's always important, for me, it's always important to center Ukraine and Ukrainians in this conflict, whether it's the military or whether it's, just civilians.
One last thing on the foreign fighters before we move on to the recon work, and then that'll be the last section when we wrap up.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the thing that unites most of them? Because they come from all over the world. Is
Mm-hmm.
there, do you think, any uniting factors, any ideological motivation, humanitarian motivation that unites many of them across the countries they come from?
That's an interesting question because, I've seen, it's really wonderful to see the kind of diversity of people helping Ukraine. I have seen people of all religions, all ethnic groups and nationalities, different gay, straight, transgender, like all these people coming together for one cause. And I think if there's one common denominator that you see a lot is that these people don't really like bullies. It's that sort of support the underdog mentality. They don't like this is one of the most black and white conflicts in recent history. You have a country that is openly trying to wage a war of imperial conquest and genocide. And the thing is, a lot of Westerners, they'll be skeptical about that. And the thing is, if you don't speak Russian and you're not familiar with that culture and you didn't live there, then, well, basically shut the fuck up. Because the Russians don't really hide these ideas about the genocide, about imperial conquest, that they believe they have the right to take any part of this country that because they believe it was theirs. They used to have an empire and they think they deserve an empire. And they also believe that the Ukrainian identity is something fake and invented and they want to get rid of it. But of course, because the Ukrainians are real people, the only way you can get rid of the Ukrainian identity is eliminating the people. And that's how you get things like Bucha. So I think a lot of people are motivated just by that, just the idea that you see this bully ganging up on a country that posed no threat to Russia at any time in its history. And you see this brutal attack like that, and a lot of people are outraged and they step up and do something. And I'll say, some people, they may have had selfish motives, naive, unrealistic. I don't know, maybe they got their ideas about it from Reddit. But, a lot of those people were either weeded out or some of them, got their heads together because they saw what was really going on. And
trial by fire?
Yeah, that's the thing is like sometimes, you can get to the right position through the wrong paths, I think, sometimes. And I mean, that's certainly, in my life, I could certainly say that where, I had wrong ideas about something, and but that somehow got me to the right ideas. So that's the thing about. But I think that the diversity of it is very impressive because, like I said, I've seen people from Colombia, Brazil, Japan, Korea, just all over, and that's the thing is a lot of people they just don't like seeing that aggression.
I wanted to ask you about the work you did after the Legion didn't really work out, the International Legion didn't work out. What do you do from there?
Okay, so because anybody coming to Ukraine trying to do this stuff, you have to have contingency plans, right? And because I've been there before, I'd already tried to join the Ukrainian military in 2017. So I already had some contingency plans, and as soon as I was free and got to Lviv, first thing I do is I get on the phone and I start trying to activate those plans, right? I'm looking for other units. I spent a few weeks there and eventually got into the unit, the 5/8, or what became the 518th Separate Special Purpose Battalion. One of my friends who I had met when we initially got to the Legion, he had a contact with that unit, and that's how I got in there. So we were in this unit that at the time was new. It was first formed in early April, which was right around the time I arrived at the beginning of last April. And so this unit was, like I said, it had kind of a core of people who were veterans of the Donbass War. And then they got a bunch of civilians. And it was a bit tricky because of just the way the Ukrainian military is still structured. It was kind of difficult to train some of these guys, just because we needed the people in command who had authority to give us the time to train them. We were actually asked, as foreigners with military experience, we were asked to help with the training. And while we had some difficulty doing that at times, we eventually were able to get some people out there and, train on the basic infantry tactics and stuff like that. And a lot of the guys got M4 carbines, for example, and a lot of these guys have never touched a weapon before, but the ones who had were familiar with Kalashnikovs, right? So we were teaching how to use the M4 and take care of it and stuff like that. And we had a few other Western weapons that came into, like M72 Laws, so the light armor weapon. So we were just, with these guys training, and, we kept moving around different locations. At one point, we were deployed as a reserve, supposedly against a potential Belarusian invasion or another invasion from Belarus. And then eventually we were sent down to Kherson Oblast, and that's where we did some operations.
Were you involved in the liberation of Kherson?
No, actually, so the part of Kherson Oblast that we were in was more in the eastern part of the oblast, whereas the capital Kherson is in the western part of that. And so forces had been driving towards the city at that point. But what we were doing is kind of coming down from the north, and I assumed the idea was to kind of do like a pincher, because we were coming, the ultimate objective was supposed to be a town called Vysokopilye. But oddly enough, we just spent like 2 days liberating this village called Ivanivka. And after that, we were just kind of, waiting around there, sort of as a reaction force. And then we were pulled back back to our what was supposed to be our permanent base. That's kind of one of the reasons why several of us left, just because we came there to fight, and we were told that we were going to continue this offensive all the way to Vysokopilye, excuse me. Now, eventually, after the Kharkiv counteroffensive started months later, eventually forces did come down and they took that city. And then, of course, after the Kharkiv counteroffensive, you had the offensive towards Kherson and eventually the liberation of the city. So I don't, because like I said, we had no information about what we were doing down there in that unit. My theory is that this was kind of part of a feint, or it was just shaping the battle space for the future campaign. Because at that time, like everyone was expecting there was going to be an offensive in Kherson. And of course, all of us were wrong. I remember by the late summer, all these people were joking. All the pro-Russians were saying, "Oh, where's your great Kherson offensive? Where's your Kherson offensive?" And then it's like, oh, by the way, Kharkiv counteroffensive, and then then there's the Kherson counteroffensive. So I think it was maybe part of this misdirection. But I will say, for as chaotic as that first mission was, we came off pretty well. I mean, the firefight lasted maybe 20 minutes. And we lost one person and had just like a handful of wounded. And like it was like lightly wounded. Like one of the guys who actually had to go to the hospital, he just had fallen and broken his hand in the engagement, so not exactly, life or career-ending, wound. And then the next day there was a bit more wounded because of shelling and stuff like that. But in general, like considering the situation, I'd say we came off pretty well. But yeah, so that was the situation in Kherson, and then after that, I went back to Kiev for a bit to explore, other units. I did a short stint with the International Legion north of Kharkiv when the Russians were still, still there. Just did some, OP duty, observation post, right? And it just didn't look like I still got some bad vibes about it. So I looked into some other options, and basically I ended up getting in with the team I'm in now. I had to go back and do some more training for that, but it took about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks or something, and then I was back out there at Kharkiv just in time for the big counteroffensive. So in total, I can say I operated in Kherson, Kharkiv, and Luhansk Oblast during this time.
During those operations, what role did you usually have in the team?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the first mission, like we were supposed to be recon, but they were kind of using us as regular infantry. So I was just a rifleman at the time. In fact, like the entire time I've been here, even like in my current team, my job officially is rifleman, and I'm basically the lowest rank you can be. And yet, in reality, we've used javelins, Stinger, drones. So it's very different from Western militaries, where what it says in your documents doesn't really reflect what you're actually going to be asked to do or what you actually do. So a lot of the missions I was on, for example, in my current team, was air defense. The thing about air defense is that, especially at the times we were there, when you hunt big game, there's always a danger that the big game doesn't show up. Mm-hmm. And the last time I was on an air defense mission, I could hear their helicopters the whole time, but they just would not come into view, because what happened is they get kind of smart, and they come in at like 9 kilometers from their target, basically, and they will they basically flare up and fire off a bunch of rockets and sort of lob the rockets, and it's rather inaccurate, but it really helps them for self-preservation, because and our side does that too. Like I've had our helicopters come in like almost right over our head and launch a bunch of rockets, and they were launching rockets at a target very far from us. So both sides are doing this because both sides have man pads, air defense basically. And so yeah, the last time I was out there, I could hear them, and I'd stand there, one guy in the tree line, everyone was behind me in their holes. And after a while, I'm like, okay, got to sit down in the hole for a while, because some shells were, coming over our head. And then if the helicopter sounded like they were getting close again, I walk out there, and I have the launcher on my shoulder and everything. And but there's one point where I thought they might actually break the tree line, but they didn't. And so yeah, that's just one role there. We were trying to do some stuff with drones. It's a lot harder than it looks, I'll tell you, because of electronic warfare. And where we are, the Russians have kind of gotten wise to drones, and so you always have to. It's like a game of chess where you're always trying to outsmart the other guy, and they're trying to outmaneuver you. But yeah, and then there's the javelin. I fucking hate the javelin.
You hate it.
Yeah,
That's America's claim to fame.
it is. Look, it's a good missile when it works, but it is. I have a love-hate relationship with it just because of how far I've had to lug that thing around, and I'm talking about the missile, not the command launch unit, which is lighter. But actually, a javelin is so the biggest injury I've had during this war was during we were infiltrating a village that was still contested, and I basically went inside, and it was pitch black inside, but some guys by the door, they had some lights on that kind of blinds you, and we were trying to get in the building and close the door because you don't want lights showing, right? I don't know why they had the lights on, but so I'm just trying to get in as fast as possible because I got guys behind me that need to get in. I had the javelin rocket over my shoulder, and I walk into the center of the room because nobody's there. Well, as it turns out, there's like a 2.5 meter service trench in the center of this room that I could not see. And so at one point I take a step, I'm flying, the javelin rocket hits the other side of the trench, which was good because it probably protected my head from hitting that. But in the process, it nearly dislocated my shoulder. It kind of rotated this around, ended up tearing a ligament. But it also kind of broke my fall as well. So it was kind of funny because I ended up down there and they're like, are you okay? Are you okay? And I'm like, I think so. I think I can stand. And they say, can you stand? I'm like, I think I can, but you have to get this rocket off of me because the rocket was like lodged in the crevice there and pinning me to the ground. And that's not including, my weapon that's on me and my assault pack and everything like that. So yeah, that's my love-hate relationship with the javelin.
When moments happen like that, where you're in legitimate danger, where like a few inches here or there could mean your life, do you have a lot of time to think about even what's going on and to process emotions?
It's really weird because I can recall like the most dangerous situations I was in, but it's very difficult for me to, like, sometimes it's like you just the next day you're like, hey, we almost died yesterday, like a shell came in, like this one time I think I mentioned earlier, we were hit with a cluster munition that opened up like all around us, and luckily we're in a forest, gave us a little bit of cover, but all these bombs are just just blowing up all around us, and I was in the dirt. I didn't know it until after that whole operation when I went to wash my pants. I found that when I was hanging them up to dry, I found that something had put a hole through the back of them. And these are very durable 511 tactical pants. Like, it's not easy to put even one hole in them. So if you looked at this, like something small just went right through it. And I have a feeling it was probably from that cluster munition. But that happened, and then I want to say 15 minutes later, we had a 152 millimeter shell come in fairly close to me, and it wounded a guy. But it was a minor wound too. Like, we were told to just keep going back after the shell exploded. And at one point we, once we're kind of out of the danger area, we saw that guy coming up, walking under his own power with a bandage on. So even that didn't really do much. But yeah, not to digress too much, the next day I had asked my buddy who was there, I said, hey, wait a minute. We had a cluster round come in before the 152, right? And he's like, yeah. And, it's weird because that's the thing, a lot of the stuff that they, that's supposed to be traumatic, I really have to concentrate to try to remember. It just sort of goes, it's like water off a duck's back. And
do you block it off, or is it just you just just move on?
Maybe my brain's just doing it automatically. I think it could just be because I got into this. I got into this when I'm older than most people. A lot of people, they join the military at 18. And, these things can be very traumatic. But for me, in my youth, I've seen people get shot at. I was robbed at gunpoint right after I got out of the U.S. Army. I had been on the front line in Ukraine in 2015. I've heard artillery and been in danger of artillery since that time. And so I think a lot of that may be the reason why it just doesn't seem to affect me as much. On the other hand, it could just be my severe untreated ADHD. I don't know.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about mines and improvised explosive devices. You said you've worked with improvised explosive devices. What is your experience with those types of explosives been?
Well, first of all, the IEDs we make are designed to be dropped from drones. So a lot of these, it's you're not using a lot of like really improvised stuff because we have all this like actual military gear, right? So like a lot of the videos you see of drones dropping grenades on guys, they're usually dropping something like a VOG 25 or VOG 17. The VOG 25 is meant to be fired from an underbarrel grenade launcher for the Kalashnikov, and a VOG 17 is a 30 millimeter grenade that is used in the AGS-17 automatic grenade launcher. And they all use a very similar detonation system, and you can basically rig them to go off on impact when they're dropped. It's basically a process of opening them up and removing two safety mechanisms in them, and then just putting it back together. And then when it's ready to go, you very carefully insert a special nose cone into it that has a nail. And when that hits the ground, the nail will hit the primer and detonate the grenade. As for mines, first let me say fuck mines. Mines suck. Like that's one of the.
Do you think they should be banned?
I would love to see mines banned, or at least the anti-personnel mines. But I could say that like of the few things that really scared me in this war going in, the things that I really worry about when I go out there, it's mines, and the other I guess would be like thermobaric rocket launchers. And luckily they came close to having to face those in my last mission out, but they were just in the area. There was just a potential that they would use them. But yeah,
Could you explain what a thermobaric rocket is?
Sure. So a thermobaric rocket or weapon or bomb is basically it's also sometimes called a fuel air explosive. It is basically is based on the principle of, I believe it's called small particle explosion. It's where basically, let's say that the bomb will have a bursting charge that will aerosolize fuel, right? So it'll turn into an aerosol. So this happens very quickly. So when it hits somewhere, that fuel is going to spread like a cloud very quickly. It's going to go into, let's say, the bunkers and doors and things like that. Anything that's not like hermetically sealed. And then what happens is that's going to ignite. It's going to be ignited from the center of that, basically. And what happens is this creates a very powerful explosion with powerful overpressure, and it will suck the oxygen out of area like a bunker or something like that. It'll quickly suck that out. And basically the killer is overpressure, and it can rupture lungs, and there's not a lot you can do to protect yourself from that. And the thing is, the Russians have like what they had in the area where it operated was, it's called the TOS-1. Buratino is the slang term for it. And this is basically like a Grad rocket launcher, except all the rockets are thermobaric. So theoretically, they could just lay down a massive amount of fire with this thing. And I remembered that they were operating in that area that I was told that. I remembered that during that mission where I was in a like a bunker. I mean, it was really originally probably a root cellar had been made into a bunker. But I was sitting down there and I'm like, yeah, we're pretty fucking safe here. And I remembered, oh, wait, they have the thermobaric. We know they had the thermobaric rocket launchers in there. So I hope they don't use those today. And well, clearly they didn't. So we're all right. But yeah, as far as mines, because the thing is, like the standard anti-tank mine around here, it should be the TM62. That will go off. That will go off basically It's like 120 kilograms, and the thing is, it's supposed to be for vehicles, but the thing is, me with all my gear on could theoretically set that mine off. You know what I mean? And then, but that's not to speak of the anti-personnel mines and those. And I've actually seen those in action, because the only real fatality, wounded situation that I witnessed here personally involved mines, and basically 3 guys walked into an anti-personnel minefield. And
do you know where was this in the country?
It's best not to say exactly where, but I'll say it's Luhansk Oblast.
Okay.
That's enough. But basically, they were these guys just got in the middle of mines. We were able to get one minor wounded out, one severely wounded out. So they're okay. But one guy, it was severely injured, because I think he stepped on a mine and then fell onto another one, and he, while we were trying to get them out of that and find a place, find a path to them, he detonated another mine, and he must have rolled on or something. I was talking to him, and I looked back at another guy. That's when I heard a bang, and I looked back, and he was out. These mines that we found in there, some of them are like about that big, like a saucer, but there were these other ones, and I could see them around them. They were like hockey pucks, little green hockey pucks. So very, very small, but it'll take your foot off easily, or just part of your
those are
foot.
the ones that they use in Afghanistan. That was really notorious.
I think you may be thinking of the PFM. That's the so-called butterfly mine.
Yeah, the butterfly mine. Yeah.
I never encountered those, but again, that's another thing to be afraid of, because those things can be launched in the thousands, and they're so small. And that's the thing, is we were out there. This situation occurred in the autumn, and so the leaves are all on the ground, and there's sticks and leaves everywhere, and there's mud everywhere. And so, we had taken a route that had been cleared, but these guys tried to take a shortcut, went to the mines, and we had to find a path to them. And ever since then, like anytime you walk in the woods, you're always thinking mines. Because we believe that we were going over positions that the Russians had abandoned, and we believe that probably they just left those behind to cover their retreat. They seem to have just been scattered everywhere. The weird thing is, like, when you look around and you see one, and then you start looking around and you start seeing them everywhere. You know what I mean? Like, there's like, oh, I see one. Oh, no, wait, it was 2. No, wait, there's 4. And and they don't take very much to set them off at all. So, mines are, they're scary, because, you can't really see them. Especially, I've been out in missions with the snow, sometimes very deep snow, right? And you're not going to see a mine under that. There's just no way, and if you step on that, you're almost guaranteed to lose half your foot. So you're going to have a very painful injury.
I wanted to ask you what type of injuries come with mines, because I know that IEDs and improvised mines and stuff like that was one of the biggest killers in I don't know the word, injuries, I don't know. One of the main casualty counters in the Middle East when we were doing the war on terror.
Yeah.
Well, not saying that we've stopped. What type of injuries come with that?
Well, it depends on the mine. I mean, in places like Iraq, they were often using very large bombs. Sometimes they were made from artillery shells or things like that. Other times there were like EFPs, which is a explosively formed penetrator, and that's basically if you have like a steel pipe, some explosives, and then you want like a copper plate. It's like a dish, right? So it's sort of concave, right? And what happens is, if done properly, when that explodes, it's going to form that metal plate into a slug. It's going at a very high speed, and that will easily go through, light vehicles, and some can go through even, harder armor, depending on how big it is. So it's hard to say, because there's a lot of different IEDs that were used. Like some of them, a very good friend of mine, he was in the Marines. He was a tanker in the Marines, and he said his Abrams was completely totaled by what was essentially just high explosives packed into a cooking oil can. And if you put enough of that in a container and blow it up under a tank or whatever, it's going to destroy it. But in terms of like mines, what you could encounter out here are there's like a Mons 50, which is like the Soviet Russian equivalent of a claymore mine. So that's a directional mine that's usually going to be triggered by a tripwire or a manual trigger. And just like the claymore, when it goes off, it's going to throw a bunch of metal balls or pieces of chopped steel. Pieces of chopped steel rod. Very nasty looking stuff. There's another one they have. It's kind of like a big bouncing Betty, but they set it off manually, and it's like about this big, and that comes up and just fires off, these little metal pieces in all directions. And then you have the anti-tank mines. You have those little anti-personnel mines, the really small ones and the slightly bigger ones. And then you would have there's another one they have is actually a booby trap mine, where it's designed so when you arm it, you put weight on it, and then if something takes the weight off, it detonates. And so these are the many ways you can get killed or maimed by mines.
Are there a lot of examples of these being placed in areas that endanger civilians, like civilian homes?
Oh yeah, you like nowadays you're hearing all the time about farmers going out in their fields, and they can be in places that were liberated months ago, and they run across a mine. There's been a lot of cases when villages are liberated. There's a lot of cases of finding booby traps in the houses, and sometimes in like kids' rooms, and among the kids' toys or
amongst their toys.
Yeah, there was also like a case of a piano in a little girl's room or something, and they had put a rather powerful grenade in it. Because you can make very simple booby traps from grenades all the time, and they tend to find a lot of those in villages that they retook. And so it's best not to touch anything, especially if the place has just been recently liberated. But never touch anything suspicious. You may see a lot of times you see these ads about explosives with the dog Patron. He's like a national star now, and they tell the kids stuff, like if you
toys, everything.
Yeah, like Patron is on these billboards and advertisements, and he says like if you see a suspicious object, don't touch it, don't move it, call the fire department, and that's
it's a cartoon now,
It is, yeah. I've seen a bit of it, yeah.
Yeah, it's cute. So we have a few more things,
yeah,
and then we're done. Just these are speed questions. Thank you for watching this Ukraine Uncensored interview. I hope this first-hand testimony of the war in Ukraine helped you better understand those who are caught in the violent throes of history. We have a bunch of other videos interviewing those affected by the war on the ground in Ukraine that you can check out on my channel. If you want to help fund my work so I can do more interviews like this in the future, please support me at my Dylan Burns TV Patreon page. I have a second YouTube channel called Dylan Burns Live, where you can see my videos from my live stream, which you can view on my Twitch or on my website, dylanburns.tv, every weekday from 6 p.m. EST to midnight. And if you want my hot takes or photos from my time in Ukraine, check out my socials, including at DylanBurns1776 on Twitter and Dylan Burns TV on Instagram. All links, including a community Discord, are in the description below. See you guys next time.